Hello and welcome to this chess endgame example of knight versus bishop. And in this position, it is white's turn to move. I've not turned on the evaluation yet, and I ask you to try and guess if you had this position, what would you play here as white? And feel free to pause if you would like to. And now I will turn on the evaluation and we can see what the computer recommends. And here it looks like the computer is recommending h4. But in this position, white uses his knight against black's position and the bishop. And so here, he moves knight to a3, attacking this pawn and forcing a decision here by black. And so, in this position, black could move b4, which is what occurred here in this game. But another option is a4, which may proceed like this. So, after a4, we have b4 by white, which prevents this pawn from moving, and next the knight can capture and also keep an eye on this passed pawn, and the play may proceed such as this. Black would try and get some counterplay here, but after c4 captures, black has these two passed pawns, but white has a pair of passed pawns here which can push forward and cause problems, and the knight and the king would work together here to stop these passed pawns of black's. And so black did not want to play into this line, and so back here after this knight to a3 move by white attacking this pawn, instead he played b4. And then we have an exchange, captures. Now the knight is under attack. And here the knight repositions down to c2. And from here, he can move to another area of the board and try and dominate this bishop, which is playing defense here. So now the bishop moves to c5, defending this pawn that is under attack by the knight. And so here we have h4 pressing forward with this pawn majority on the king side. And so the king remains on this h5 square so that if this pawn pushes forward, he can capture this remaining pawn. But the knight jumps down here to e1 where it can jump over to g2 and keep an eye on this pawn. And so the bishop, it really doesn't have much to do, so it just kind of plays waiting moves, moving back here to b6, where it could potentially jump to d8 and eye this pawn, preventing an immediate push. Well, not quite preventing. If this pawn is pushed, we could have an attack. But this knight is positioned to jump in here and help defend. So white reacts immediately, protecting the pawn. The bishop just moves back and forth here. If the bishop would have tried to attack here, we would have a g4 pawn push that would check the king, forcing him away from this pawn anyway. So white pushes forward, checking the king, and the king retreats, and so we have these pawns, they've made progress, and now the knight repositions back to the center of the board where it may jump over to c2 or in the future f3 after the king is moved. And so now the bishop is attacking this pawn. And so we have the king moving to protect. And here, black has options. In the game, he moved to d8 here, but bishop to d6 is possible. So then, if we had knight to c2, this pawn would be protected, and then a possible bishop to c5, trying to keep the knight out of this position. But instead, after bishop to d6, instead of moving to c2, knight to f3 is also possible. And so then, if the king would move to f6 to help cover this and release this bishop from protective duty of this pawn, we could have g5 here, and then after captures, the knight could capture here, and it puts pressure on this pawn, but also we would have a passed pawn here. And so black wanted to avoid these lines, and so instead, if we go back, bishop to d8 was played in this position. And so after bishop to d8, we have knight to c2 attacking this pawn. And so the bishop moves to protect. And then we have a capture in the center, capture, and then knight to e3 attacking this unprotected pawn. And so here we have this pawn push attacking this d3 pawn, but also leaving this pawn undefended. And so another option in this position could have been, instead of this e4 pawn push, d4 could have been played, but black avoided this line because after the d4 pawn push, the knight would jump up into black's position, attacking the bishop, and after the bishop protects, the king could move towards the center, and the bishop just moves back and forth, and now the king jumps into this e4 square, attacking this pawn, and the bishop could protect. But after knight to b6, we have the bishop moving back and giving up this pawn, but attacking the h4 pawn. And the game could proceed with the knight moving back into position here. And after captures, capture with check. And so this pawn is protected by the knight, the king is in check, and white could capture this pawn or move to defend here in case the king comes to g5. And so black wanted to avoid these lines, and so instead of this d4 pawn push, after knight to e3, he moves with the e4 pawn. And so then we have knight captures, bishop to d6 check, and now we have a block. And this block works because the king is in check here. And so we have the possibility, if the bishop would capture, king captures, e takes d3, but the king would be able to stop this pawn. And so black decided against that line. And if we go back, instead of capturing here, the king is in check. And so we have a king move, but the other pawn is captured. And so now black is in trouble, as white has a passed pawn in the center and a pawn majority here on the king side, and play continued with king to e5, blocking here, preventing progress by this passed pawn and attacking it. And so the king moves to protect, and now the king tries to move down to keep an eye on this pawn, but potentially harass this b3 pawn. And so this was a good move by white here, as it prevents the king from moving down and trying to capture this pawn and create a passed pawn of his own. And so the king is forced to move here instead of being able to move to c3, and he will try to possibly go to c2 and then capture. But after g5, capture, capture, white creates a passed pawn here, and black is really in trouble now. He tries to capture, but this pawn is moving forward on the king side and must be stopped by this bishop. But after capture with check, capture, and now the knight repositions, attacking this bishop. And once the bishop moves to g7 to block this pawn, and keep an eye on this pawn, here it is too late. After this pawn move, if the bishop captures, then white will just win, recapturing and being able to push this pawn. And if the bishop tries to back up to the f8 square, then both pawns will push forward and the bishop will be able to capture one but not the other. And so here white used his knight to dominate the position over the black bishop, and these games are very interesting where it's a knight versus bishop, and I encourage you to play over positions like this, study games that involve this play between the knight and bishop, because many games they can go either way. Generally knights prefer positions that are blocked in and have many pawns. Bishops prefer open positions, and also if the pawns have been broken apart and there are small islands of pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop will do better in those types of positions. So once again, I encourage you to just play out these different positions and try to find the strengths and weaknesses of the bishops and the knights. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you and have a great day.